Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of the Mixtape with Scott. I am your host, Scott Cunningham. This is a podcast where the world of economics, the field, and the personal stories of economists kind of collide in an interview style. Today we have a truly special guest with us, none other than the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics recipient, Dave Card. This interview rounds out my interviews with the 2021 Nobel laureates, and I was absolutely thrilled to have a chance to meet him. I'd never met him, never spoken with him. Anybody who's read my book can obviously tell I'm a huge admirer, and he's had a major influence on me, as he has many others. I'm absolutely thrilled to share this remarkable conversation that we had. As many of you know, I am kind of obsessed with Princeton Industrial Relations section in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Under Orly Ashenfelter, it just produced a bunch of people that really changed the profession. Probably all of us are different as a result of it. And Dave is one of those people that really probably helped shape a lot of us. But unlike a lot of the Princeton interviews I've done, we didn't really talk a lot as much about Princeton as we did about things that I think a lot of people are really going to find interesting. The kind of tumultuous and sometimes contentious debates that happened in the wake of a lot of Dave's most renowned works, namely the minimum wage paper he wrote with Alan Kruger. We really got behind the scenes. He shared a lot. I asked a lot of questions. He shared a lot with me about that time and about the fighting that actually did happen. And I learned a lot. And we also, I think you're going to learn also a lot about even deeper things about the nature of knowledge and where knowledge comes from in economics. If it comes from what is evidence and is theory evidence and all these very, very deep things. We kind of ended up having a conversation about it. Dave's wonderfully candid throughout the conversation, a lot of insights, a lot of stories. But there's one story that he shares at the very beginning that's breaking news. And I sort of feel like I'm Matt Drudge delivering the exclusive news. I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to let him tell you, but it's hot off the press. But just wanted to say, remember, the Mixtape with Scott is more than just the technicalities and theories of economics. It's about connecting those concepts, the oral history of economics itself, with the personal narratives of actual living economists. It's about understanding how these sort of work together, shape our professional life and shape our personal life. And then, of course, I'm going to say stories are important. People's stories are important. Dave Card's story, his personal story is important, and your story is important. Stories help us make sense of the world. They guide us, they inspire us, and on occasion they caution us. They weave together to form complex quilt of our lives. And I think for many of you listening, economics is our home. And being an economist is a lot about our identity. So my hope is that through this good or bad, to be honest, and my hope is that through this podcast, you find a thread that really touches you, really resonates with your own experiences, provides a fresh perspective on navigating the course of this life. So anyway, as we embark on this journey, we're not just exploring the story of economics. This is the personal story, or at least a little bit of it, of a living economist, David Card. I hope you enjoy hearing his story as much as I have enjoyed hearing it too. So let's get started. Well, it is my honor, my pleasure to have on the podcast Dr. David Card, winner of the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics. Dr. Card, Dave, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Well, before we get started, could you tell me, everybody, your name, your job title, and the name of the firm that signs your paycheck?
I'm a professor of economics. My name's David Card, and I'm employed at the University of California, Berkeley for one more week, and then I'm going emeritus.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, I get to announce it. I get to break the breaking
Break
news.
the news. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna put a spoiler alert up on the thing. Okay, well, before we get started even more, I was wanting to do an icebreaker. So, what's a vacation or a trip that you went on in, the last 20 years or so that to this day you still think about?
Um, in 2003, my father was a farmer, and he was always very interested in visiting Nebraska.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because all tractors sold in the United States are tested in Nebraska, at the Nebraska University of Nebraska test grounds. And so he wanted to visit the test grounds and see where this was done for historical reasons. So anyway, I had bought a pickup truck that I was going to uh, give to him. And so I bought a used pickup truck in California, and we drove all the way to Canada. But we stopped in various places along the way. That was the first time he'd driven across the U.S.
Hmm.
And we stopped in Nebraska. We stopped at the John Deere factory in Iowa, and we went on a tour. He was a John Deere, true believer in John Deere tractors.
Yeah.
And then we visited a couple of other sites along the way. So it was a lot of fun, and we had lot of time to talk.
Where'd you start and how long? Where'd you start and you ended in Nebraska?
Santa Rosa, California, where
Oh,
I am right now, actually. Yeah,
wow. I bet that's quite a drive.
it's a nice drive. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
America's
It's a great country to see in a big pickup truck. Yeah.
yeah. That's it's one of the best things about America, those road trips. We have a pretty country. Um, okay, well, so that actually is a great segue into my first question. So I read that your parents were dairy farmers. I was just wondering, what were your days and nights like when you were a kid? What kind of games and stuff did you enjoy doing?
Uh, I probably like I was a child of the 50s, born in 1956. And so in the early 60s, we had a TV. Weren't allowed to watch it too much. We watched it a couple hours a day. We I always hung out with my brother, who was 2 years younger than me, and we spent a lot of time just fiddling around on the farm. Growing up on a farm is a great thing for a kid because you get to just hang out and do whatever you're doing. And um, we, built forts in the haymow and went wandering in the fields and stuff. And there were a few neighborhood kids that we played with a lot.
Yeah.
We had my mother had a great big garden, so we had quite an extensive network of roads and stuff for our trucks.
Oh
So we
yeah.
had, we had a good time.
I bet that was wonderful. I bet that was great. And so you ended up going. So when you were in high school, what sort of stuff did you like doing outside of school?
Um, I was I had some good friends in the neighborhood, and so we kind of had we hung out a lot. You know, doing illegal stuff like drinking beer and stuff like that. And then I kind of got involved indirectly in student politics. I became the president of the Students' Council at my high school, which is a pretty big high school. I had like 2,400 kids.
Wow.
So I was kind of actively involved in that. I never played any sports. I'm completely hopeless on sports.
What was your greatest accomplishment as president of the high school?
Well, we had two major breakthroughs, three actually. The first two were women were not allowed to wear pants.
Uh-huh.
Um, this is like 1970, I'm guessing like 1975 or so, and no, 1973. And so we managed to convince the administration to let women wear pants to school.
Yeah.
That was a major breakthrough. Then we got smoking on school grounds.
You
Um,
got it passed that you could
yeah,
smoke.
you could smoke on the school grounds.
There you
That was a
go.
big breakthrough. I mean, it turned out that was probably a bad idea, but at the time it seemed like a major breakthrough.
It's a
And then
checker.
the major thing I did that had a long run impact, probably, I mean, pants were probably going to come anyway, and smoking didn't last that long. But we took over the student cafeteria. The student council took over the running of the student cafeteria and became a source of income for the student council for years afterwards. My brother
Oh,
taught at that high school for many years afterwards, and it was always, they were always very wealthy because they got all the income from the student council.
oh,
Student council.
that's cool. Wow, that's really cool. So how did that whole experience, how do you think that it was? So after that experience, what kind of how did you sort of see what kind of life you were wanting to have at the end of high school?
Um, I didn't really think of it too much. I didn't really know anything about economics when I went to college, and I actually was in science program originally. I was kind of pretty sure I didn't want to be a farmer. And at that time in the neighborhood, they were all pretty small farms, 100 or 200, 300 acres kind of farms.
Yeah.
Nowadays, there's almost no farms left. They're all great big huge, and so they're all consolidated. So very few of my friends from that time remained in the farming business.
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and eventually kind of came on to economics, and that was a good fit for me.
That was in college. You stumbled
Yeah,
on in college, like sort of a couple years in.
yeah. Actually, the beginning of my third year in college, I was signed up in the physics program, and my girlfriend at the time was taking intro economics using a textbook, Lipsey and Sparks and Steiner. So that was
Hmm.
Richard Lipsey was a professor at Princeton or Queens, excuse me, where I was an
Hmm.
undergrad, and he had written this famous textbook that was widely used in England.
Hmm.
Uh, and he was a very good instructor. But anyway, this textbook, it was a bit more advanced than textbooks today. That's something that's happened in economics. I don't know if people are aware of it, but I would say the classes have dumbed down a little bit.
Hmm.
So Lipsey's textbook is quite good. It has the elasticity formulas.
Oh.
And my girlfriend at the time was having a hard time with that. She wasn't too great on that kind of math. And so she asked me to give her a hand, and I started reading the book. And I thought, boy, this is really interesting. uh, and I basically read 2/3 of the book. If you grew up on a farm and no one's ever explained like how demand and supply curves work, it's actually quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Did that when you were reading it, did it sort of all make sense of what your parents' sort of job was like or something?
Well, one thing it explains is for agricultural products, the elasticity of demand is less than one, almost for sure. And so you can have a paradox that it's a poor year for crops, but everybody's better off.
Ah, right.
So that's helpful.
You noticed that as a kid? Your parents, you
It
were
was
aware of
kind
that?
of known that that was a problem, like in the Canadian wheat business, for
Uh-huh.
instance. Yeah, you could have a very good crop isn't necessarily good.
Right. Huh. That's interesting. So then you read that you saw that there was there might be a rational reason for that.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out that probably that's the one place where simple demand and supply things work pretty well as agricultural markets.
Right.
Like my field, it's probably a bit more dodgy, but
Right.
I didn't quite realize that at the time. Yeah,
Yeah. So it was a textbook. So it was a textbook, and that's what sort of started to sort
yeah.
of
So then
spike.
I signed up for a class uh, in my third year. I was kind of pretty far behind.
Yeah.
I was good shape because I'd taken quite a few math classes,
Mhm.
but I was far behind in terms of economics. So as a result, I could only take my first year in economics was really my third year, and I was way behind.
Mm.
So I took a first semester. I took intro class, and that was going okay. So the second semester, I said, well, I should maybe take a couple of econ classes, but I didn't have any prerequisites
Mm.
because at that time you needed to have second year classes to get into most of the
Yeah.
topic classes. And the only two classes I could take were both were taught by relatively recent PhD students who graduated from Princeton, both of them, with Orly
Oh.
as their advisor. One
Oh.
was Charles Beach and one was Michael Abbott. And they were teaching income distribution, that was Charlie's class, and labor economics, that was Mike's class. And so I took
Huh.
those two classes.
Wow. Huh. So I'm guessing this is where Princeton and Orly starts to become things you're aware of.
Yeah, basically the first year I was an economist, I thought that he must be the king of all economics.
How quickly do you, how is there a gap between college and going to grad school, or do you go straight to grad school?
Yeah, back then people pretty much went straight.
You
Yeah,
went
I went.
straight in. And
Mhm.
was it Princeton the only place you were sort of had your eyes on?
Um, I got into Harvard. I didn't get into MIT. Um, and but at that time, I mean, these two guys, Mike and Charlie, and there were some other faculty at Queens that had PhDs from Princeton. One who's still there actually is James McKinnon, the
Oh yeah.
Beecham McKinnon guy, or McKinnon and Davidson, and Russell Davidson was also there.
Yeah.
So I took classes from those dudes,
Huh.
and they all thought that the Princeton program was far better. You know, it was more rigorous, and it was at that time way more rigorous than the Harvard program.
Huh. That was so that was a widely kind of, was that a minority opinion, or was that like Princeton people thought that, or was that even something even outside of Princeton people kind of had that feeling?
I think at that time, everyone thought of MIT as the most rigorous or whatever, the most, because Bob Solo was still very active advising people, and
Yeah.
that was it turned out that was many of the other ass profs that were hired at the same time as me were educated there, but
Yeah.
uh, I don't think Harvard was a major as big a player as they turned out to be much later, or they certainly weren't actually.
When they said rigorous when you were going into grad school, what did they mean by it then? Was it the same? Did it mean the same thing then as it means now?
It It certainly did. The first year grad program, micro, was taught by a famous professor, Hugo Sonnenschein.
Uh-huh.
And it was, we worked through very, very detailed proofs, someplace in between Malenvaux and Gerard Debreu's book.
Oh,
Um, Very, very intensive. And uh, it was I probably at the time one of the most rigorous micro courses in the field,
yeah.
and many of the game theorists of the subsequent game theorists from that generation graduated from Princeton. So after I came back on the faculty, I taught with Hugo. I taught that class, so he kind of split it with me, and I taught sort of a bit more applied orientation, the first kind
Mm,
of um, consumer demand and producer theory stuff, but still a pretty high level,
yeah.
continuity of demand functions.
Right.
I can still
Right.
give that proof off the top of my head, probably. But so we had many great students. Dilip Abreu, I
Mm,
taught microtheory to Dilip Abreu, David Pierce,
mm.
Inku Cho, um, uh, quite a few of the really prominent people of that generation.
Well, it's funny the way you're talking, because I was going to ask you, it seems like you could have been one of these labor economists like Gary Becker, who specializes in primarily theoretical work. And I definitely, even the way you're talking now, it sounds like that could have been a choice you made, but you seem to have specialized in being an empiricist really early. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I that was the Princeton tradition in labor
Oh,
economics. So, I mean, people knew how to do consumer theory and so on. I don't know. Most people maybe don't know, but um, Orly has a pretty nice paper in econometric. It won the Frisch Prize actually, and it's on
mm,
how to model unemployment as a rationing.
oh,
So it's still somewhat controversial, although maybe less so now because no one's thought about it for a long time. But at that time, this was just 70s. It was the era when people started to want to model unemployment as completely voluntary,
ah,
heavily influenced by Lucas and Rapping and their revisionist history of the Great Depression.
yeah.
But Orley's view was that you were signed up with an employer, and then you had a certain number of hours you could work, and the rest of the time you didn't, and so you'd have to think about how that affected your consumer demand functions.
Hmm.
It's a nice framework, but it hasn't really been followed up very much in the
Hmm.
field. But at the time, it was recognized, and so it's got like a pretty nice use of expenditure functions to sort of solve some of the problems with
Yeah.
that setup.
Well, so when did you feel like you knew that you wanted to be a labor economist? Was that something that you sort of,
Pretty much right away, as soon as I went to grad school. Yeah, actually, I kind of went to grad school knowing that that was probably the field I was interested in.
how come? What was it about it?
Well, because of those courses, I did
Ah,
my senior thesis on strike activity, and
mm,
um, I, uh, I had a lot of jobs because my father's farm was pretty small. There wasn't really enough jobs for keeping me busy on the farm. So I had all kinds of jobs. I worked in research farm. I worked in a steel factory for a couple of years.
ah,
That was probably hourly rate. That might have been the best job I've ever had.
yeah,
It was a unionized steel plant, and it was an incentive pay. So
oh,
I was able to, one of the few people that could tolerate working with one of the guys that just regularly we earned like 3 times the standard base rate.
oh, wait. So incentive pay, so you're getting paid by what you're pulling out of the ground?
Yeah, but by how many
Oh,
pieces it was making steel culverts, big steel
oh,
culverts.
does that persist as a what they do in in that industry, or does it change?
Um, well, the steel industry always had very extensive use of incentive pay.
Huh.
Um, Steel industry was organized by the mine workers. I guess people
Oh,
don't know that, but back in my time, everybody knew that. There was a steelworkers organizing committee that was organized by the mine union. The miners union was a much more old-fashioned, much more powerful union at that time.
yeah,
And so miners are always paid by incentive basis because you get paid how many tons of coal you pull out.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I guess it might have been that. It might have been there's so many different tasks, and people have some autonomy with these big machines, and they want to keep the machines operating.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't know exactly. That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, so how did you get drawn to this section, to the industrial relations section when you were
That at that time you kind of came to when you came to Princeton as a PhD student, if they kind of knew you were interested in labor economics, they would kind of give you a little sub office on the it was in the IR section was in the library, the main library of campus.
Uh-huh.
The reason why it was called the IR section because it was that section of the library.
Oh, okay, good.
There
That's
was another group called the International Finance section. And it's also quite an important group at Berkeley. That's at Princeton. I mean, that's the group that does international trade.
oh, I see. I see.
But so the Irish section, I think really from my first year, I was given a carrel in the office that was beside the IR section, and then I got some part-time, some jobs my first year doing some coding.
Yeah. What was it like? Do you remember your first time that you met Orly?
Uh, I do remember one thing. It was about March of 1978. That was the year I graduated from college, and I'd applied to PhD programs. And I was sitting at home, the phone rang. I think it might have been on a Saturday, but 10:30 or 11 a.m. And it turned out it was Orly on the phone. Now, the remarkable thing about Orly is that he has exactly the same voice and accent as this other guy that I knew, my advisor, Michael Abbott. Michael was one of his students, but it's like a remarkable thing that they have the same voice because
Mm-hmm.
both have very unique voices.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so I thought it was Michael playing a joke on me, but it turned out it was Orly, and so he, was talking to me, trying to talk me into going to Princeton, but he did a good job, but I was, pretty easy to convince
Yeah, sure, sure, sure. Well, so what was your first impression working with him,
working with them.
or just even, having him as a professor or just being around you?
Well, he was kind of he was very engaged at that time, engaged with advising all the PhD students. So it was really a one-man show, the IR
Yeah,
section. It was him
yeah.
most of the time. And so he would come in a little late and he went swimming. He used to swim every day
Uh.
for an hour or so. And then he came back after swimming and smoked a giant cigar, giant like Havana type cigar.
Yeah.
So the whole IR section smelled like cigar smoke. It's people can't really imagine how much smoking there used to be in academia.
Even in the high
I
schools,
once
I
saw
hear there
Bob
was a lot of
Lucas.
smoking.
Yeah, I once saw Bob Lucas give a talk, and I swear he smoked a whole package of cigarettes in that seminar. It
Man,
was just one after the other. It was awesome.
that's awesome.
Um, anyway, so and then people would chat with him for a while, and he'd talk on the phone to his co-authors. At that time, if you were working with somebody who wasn't there, you had to do it on the phone.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was, and I met like Joe Altonji was a year ahead of me, and Joe was already working with him. One of my first jobs was helping Joe and Orly were working on a paper trying to test the time series properties of wage movements. And at that time, people didn't had just discovered the idea of the unit root test.
Uh-huh.
That if you run a regression of yt on yt minus one, and it's truly a unit root, it's not going to be centered at one, it's going to be centered below one. And so you need to adjust the confidence interval.
Uh-huh.
And I might be the first labor economist to ever coded up the Dickey-Fuller test.
Yeah. That's great. Uh, you have this, I know that you have this amazing speech you gave in 2012 at Michigan on this design versus model based, and I kind of want to segue a little bit, but
Oh, okay. Yeah.
um, the sense I get from little bitty things that you've said, and I guess that the quotes that you pulled out from other people, it sounded like in the 70s there was like a bit of an empirical crisis. And
Oh, for sure.
I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit, were you aware of it at the time, or is that something that you, looking back, sort of have said?
Oh no, it was very clear. There's many elements of it. I guess I could, if we got time, I guess I can give a bit of an overview of this. Um, so when you were studying papers at that time, there weren't nearly as many papers. So
Mm.
if you were doing a grad labor class, you might count on trying to study 20 papers for the whole course.
Oh, huh.
But you go in depth. It was a very
Right.
different way of doing things than a lot of people do these days. I still prefer that way, but so you go through the paper in great detail,
Yeah.
or you get the students to present it in depth. And that was actually Orly's method.
Mm.
But it was pretty obvious that the empirical results were not the main thing. It was all mostly the methods. And a lot of times people didn't even really worry too much about the empirical results. And
Huh.
so in the labor economics class, 1980, I guess, or fall of 79, maybe. I was taking this class, and I presented Tom Sargent's paper on dynamic labor demand, which is at that time was a pretty much very important paper. It's about how to interpret aggregate labor demand with wages and employment in the aggregate economy.
Mm-hmm.
Now it turns out, if you read that, which I know that paper extremely well, but I'm probably one of the few people that still does. I'm sure Tom does. It turns out that it's not identified. He shows the picture of the likelihood, and it's flat.
Mm.
So there's a kind of a multiplicity, because he's just using time series data, and there's like multiple routes to this question, to this
Right.
solution. And but no one worried about that, because that wasn't important. What was important was how to solve the rational expectations problem and get it into the forward expectations of wages, get that into the employer's demand equation.
Yeah. Right.
But that was very common,
How
and
did that feel for you? What did that feel like? I mean, was
I didn't really think of it too much. But it was empirical work wasn't really what economists were supposed to. That wasn't so much important. Now there was kind of an exception, and that was when it came to like really directly policy evaluation kind of
right.
stuff. And so like Ashenfelter had done a couple of things before that my time there, and trying to study the effect of government training programs.
Yeah.
And the results in those program evaluations were all over the map.
Mm-hmm.
And he subsequent to after grad school, we got called. There was a big evaluation that was underway by SRI International, which was the research operation. Actually, they implemented the Seattle-Denver income maintenance experiment, but they were doing an evaluation of the training programs under President Carter.
Mm.
Uh, and called CETA, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, I guess it was called. So they were doing a CETA evaluation, and they were trying to compare different methodologies. And one methodology was sort of a Mahalanobis matching method.
Mm-hmm.
This was before people knew about propensity score matching, but they knew about Mahalanobis matching.
Mm.
And then another was kind of regression models and so on. And it was, the results were all over the map, depending on how you did the map, the matching, or how you did the regression, and who you chose as a comparison group. And that was very, very common.
Mm.
And it was kind of frustrating because you could implement pretty state-of-the-art type of methods. So in the course of doing that, Orly and I wrote a paper where we basically implemented a pretty advanced for that time method of moments estimator that essentially we were trying to deal with the fact that the people going into training programs you don't have parallel trends with the treatment group and the control group. The treatment group has kind of had a dip beforehand.
Yeah.
So we had a selection adjusted parallel trends kind of differences estimator.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you know that there's a selection based on earnings in a certain period, you're going to kind of, if the earnings are serially correlated, you're going to go down and then come back up.
Right. Right.
And that idea had been actually recognized by Jim Heckman a few years before. And so, but I coded the whole thing up, and that was in our restud paper.
Yeah.
But what we found even with that was that we could get different answers depending on whether we assumed that people who went into training in 1976, for example, had the earnings decrease was the pivotal event was the earnings that they would have gotten in 1976, or it was the earnings they actually got in 1975. It kind of fit about the same, but they had different implications for what the training program impact was. And so we sort of said, you can't really easily solve this problem.
How come you're responding differently to that than say that Sargent thing, where it's kind of like you were saying the Sargent paper, it's sort of illustrating the method, but it sounds like this is different.
Well, I think fundamentally, that's the Sargent thing is macro.
Yeah.
And I don't know. My impression was that no one ever thought that there was really a scientific answer to anything in macro.
Oh, okay. But in labor,
they still don't.
Yeah. I have this interpretation. I was just wondering, how much of this is being driven by rising, poverty and large government programs and recessionary shocks and inequality. I mean, how much of these kinds of like the gravity of getting answers right are in direct response to just the economic moment that you were in the 70s? Is it something else? Or
I mean, that might have been part of it. It was also the case that I think it was understood that if somebody had credible evidence that these training programs did or didn't work, that could actually matter.
right.
So in other words, there was kind of an indication that evidence might matter for the policy. And it's much less direct in a lot of other types of economics. So that that's actually an interesting question, why that particular area was a little bit different. But I'll give a couple of other examples of what I mean by the crisis. So around that time, just a few years after that, Ed Leamer's book comes out and his famous article, "Let's Take the Con Out of Econometrics."
Yeah.
Around the same time, David Hendry, who's still an active econometrician in the UK, had written I guess it was his inaugural lecture as a professor at LSE. It was called Econometrics and Alchemy or something like that.
Yeah.
It was sort of basically saying it was based on time series stuff and saying like there's too many loose ends in the way people do things, and it gives too much discretion to the researcher.
Wow.
Then another thing that was pretty important, there was one really strong tradition in labor economics where everybody took everything seriously, and that was in the estimation of union wage effects.
Oh.
And probably that was because of H. Greg Lewis.
Oh.
So he was the primary labor economist at the University of Chicago all through the 50s and 60s. He eventually retired and moved to Duke and spent the last years because Chicago had mandatory retirement. But and he had trained this previous generations of labor economists. He was the advisor to Gary Becker and to Sherwin Rosen and many, many, many others. And he's sort of the guy who indirectly discovered the selection bias correction. He's got a paper on selection bias that kind of comes about before Jim Heckman's stuff.
Hmm.
He didn't have the exact formula, but he understood that. And he was extremely serious about empirical. He had been Paul Douglas's research assistant.
Oh.
So he was a very strong empiricist. There was a kind of a joke at the IR section. You know, somebody presented a result and somebody would say, well, does it pass a Lewis test? And the Lewis test was that Greg Lewis would think you actually made sense what you just said.
Was
And
it
he was
hard
kind of a scary guy because he was, you know, pretty senior and pretty formal.
Yeah.
I had a job working for him at the IR section. He was visiting the IR section when I was
Oh, I'm
first year
having a
student.
memory now. You say in that speech that he does a review of all the union papers and just almost drops all the IV ones.
He just dropped all the IV and selection corrections, said they're not credible.
He said they're not credible.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like the Godfather of the field saying, you know, all this work that you guys have been doing, maybe the methodology is interesting, but it's not really getting us anything that we should really pay attention to.
Yeah. So so you're you feel that way as a grad student. I know you obviously feel that way eventually, but like even as a grad student, you were like, I'm kind of like that also.
Not sure. I mean, I think I've never understood why anybody would. Well, here's a good example. I've never understood why anybody would fake their data
Yeah.
because I mean, I don't understand why you would think that. I guess it's because you're going to get the paper published, but fundamentally, you would know that it wasn't what you said it was.
Right.
So it doesn't really make any sense to me that you would do that because you
Yeah.
would be, you know, you wouldn't have figured it out.
And
So I
you
think
spent a
Lewis
lot
is,
of time. You spent a lot
yeah,
of time
and
with
I think
them.
Lewis is like that. He's like he wanted to actually know,
Right.
and
Right.
in a way, he didn't really care if other people didn't have that obsessive
Yeah.
interest in it. I think that's a very helpful perspective on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That a lot of things that you know economists or other academics or researchers can do. There might not be a huge audience for it, but it's still important to get it right.
Yeah.
And so I think I've always thought it was more like you're trying to get it right and really know for sure whether what you say, whether this hypothesis or idea that you have is correct.
Well, so at Princeton, you know, when I think about Bob Lalone's job market paper, the thing that strikes me is this kind of a falsification ingenuity kind of thing. It's not just trying to answer in a question. It was just this almost like I'm gonna expose how bad things are. Was that how that is that an
Well, I
incorrect
think
view of it?
that puts it in a slightly negative light. Or, uh, you know, Bob wasn't like that.
Uh-huh.
He's a very positive guy.
Hmm.
So you could put it in that light, but I don't think that was really the light that we, you know, he was the first student I worked with closely as a PhD student.
Hmm.
So he was only a couple of years behind me in grad school, and then I came back to Princeton on the faculty, and I spent many, many hours with him
Hmm.
talking over what he was doing and how it all fit together.
Yeah.
It was more like what the idea was: can we provide some guidance, or can his work provide some guidance as to what's
Oh,
working and what's not?
right. Right.
It wasn't like to make fun of the people who got it wrong. It was really more to say, this method looks like, or this way of selecting a good method.
Yeah.
Like what could you do to find out that your method was actually doing okay?
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and, you know, people knew about over identification tests, and that was a sort of an important idea, but it was sort of understood that those weren't decisive, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
partially because our models are never good enough to pass over identification tests.
Yeah. 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 Well, so when does Dr. Kruger get to Princeton? I'm curious about y'all's first time to meet and sort of what he was like early on as a colleague.
Oh, I have quite a few good stories about that. So I was an Ask Prof at Princeton, and we were kind of low on people. There had been another guy who was an assistant professor, but he didn't get tenure. Jim Brown, his name was James Brown.
Mhm.
And so Jim moved on to, he went on to SUNY Stony Brook.
Uh-huh.
And so we were kind of looking for somebody to hire. And uh, I think we tried, and labor economics was, they're starting to get a little more interest in labor economics,
At Harvard or at Stony Brook?
just in the profession,
Oh, in the
maybe.
profession, it was
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean, I
emerging.
had gone to Chicago and come back.
Yeah.
And the reason why the reason why they hired me was because the year I was away, Orly got an offer from MIT.
Oh.
And so MIT was going to actually hire a labor economist. That was a major thing, right? That's sort of like, oh my God.
Oh, so that was
Um,
there hadn't really been.
well, they had hired Hank Farber the year before. He was one of Orly's students, but they thought they needed a more senior guy to.
So they had
Now
they were
they started.
making some moves. They were trying to
They're
build
making
it
some
up.
moves, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we looked at a couple of people, and they turned us down. The most prominent one that turned us down, I remember, was Larry Katz.
Oh, he turned you down.
Yeah, so Larry had come out of MIT and gone directly back to Berkeley, where he was an undergrad.
Oh.
And I think, 80s in Berkeley wasn't the greatest time. The resources were thin, and
Oh.
people didn't, it was pretty insular. And so I think it was, he liked it there, and he liked George Akerlof and Janet Yellen, but he felt a little bit lonely. And so then he went back on the job market after a year or two.
Yeah.
And so we tried to hire him, and he went to Harvard. And anyway,
Mhm.
so then along comes Alan a couple of years later in a cohort. And he was not on the list to be interviewed by Princeton at the meetings, but he had the good fortune. He was from New Jersey,
Yeah.
upstate New Jersey, and he had the good fortune to sit beside Jen Ashenfelter, Orly's wife, on the
Hmm.
way. And so she was a very social person, and she knew a lot about economics because she'd been listening to it for years.
Yeah.
And so she started talking to him and was extremely impressed by him. And
Yeah.
so after the flight was over, I forget what city the meetings were in. It might have been New Orleans or someplace like that.
Yeah.
She went and got Orly and said, Orly, you have to interview this guy. So Orly got disrupted everything and got and Alan on. This is not kind of thing that's not allowed anymore.
Right. 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 Yeah. It's like
This is
yeah. Yeah.
completely against all these rigorous rules we have about
Right.
protocols and stuff. But it was an extremely lucky move because Harvard had many people on the job market that year, John Bound and Allen and David Newmark. And I think
Mm.
we might have been interviewing the other two, but not Allen.
Hmm.
I don't really know why, but anyway, Allen came out and he was obviously, he had this paper. It wasn't his job market paper, but he had this paper with Larry Summers on efficiency wage differences. And there's a really remarkable thing about that paper, which probably no one really knows about anymore. But that was the first paper I ever saw where they took the coefficient estimates and applied a shrinkage estimator.
Mm.
So they basically said, okay, these coefficients are attenuated. We got to kind of adjust for that. And
Oh.
very obvious. And it was pretty clear that Alan knew how to do all that. And he'd taken a couple of stats classes at Cornell,
Uh-huh.
um, and they had old-fashioned statisticians that were training people a little bit differently than econometricians.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, Orly and I thought, well, we should try and push for him, and he got hired.
What impressed you about him? What, like, if not knowing anything, pretend I don't know.
Well,
What?
that was pretty impressive, I thought. It was kind of wide-ranging. He was very interested at that time in testing efficiency wage models, and
Uh,
he had a paper. Turns out to have been a result that holds up actually, which was that fast food restaurants that are managed directly by the company pay a higher wage premium to the manager than ones that are owned by a franchisee. And the argument Alan made was the franchise guy has more control and spends more time in the store, so he can monitor the managers more directly.
what? So you guys end up working on this minimum wage paper that also is about fast food. So, I mean, is there something natural about the two of you kind of coming together on this project? Just given what you just said about
Well, actually, that um, the way that evolved was slightly differently. So at the end of the 80s, there started to be some state-specific minimum wages above the federal level for the first time in a long time.
Uh-huh.
So California had one, and then and so uh, people started to look at that. And Alan had was interested in fast food stuff, and so he and Larry Katz did a survey of what happened in Texas when they raised the minimum wage to a bunch of fast food restaurants. So it was the federal increase, but you had fast food restaurants in Texas.
Uh-huh.
They didn't really have a control group,
Right.
but it was there was some interesting stuff about the study. I had done a more of a classic difference of differences thing, looking at the effects of California raising its minimum wage using comparing other states. And then there was this conference that was held. Princeton and Cornell used to have an annual conference. It was Cornell Princeton Conference. They were the two bastions of old-fashioned labor economics, or
Uh-huh.
somewhat institutionally based labor economics, I guess you'd say. And so we'd all get in a van and go to Cornell because they had a nice site to have the conference. And each year there was one of the two institutions would pay for it. It wasn't a huge group, but anyway, so one of these conferences was on the minimum wage. That was the topic.
Uh-huh.
And so I presented my California paper. Alan and Larry presented their paper. I think Newmark and Washer presented a paper, maybe.
What'd you find in your California paper? That was a diff and diff paper too?
Yeah. Wages went up, no loss of employment.
Okay.
And after the conference, but in time to get the paper in the conference volume, I did another paper where I realized that if you raise the federal minimum, and some states already have passed a minimum wage, then you kind of have what now is called the gap design.
Mm.
So some states are basically treated and partially
Oh.
treated and are not treated.
Yeah.
And so I basically did that paper, which also showed wages go up as as you'd expect, but there's no loss of employment.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was kind of done, and the results were there, but they came out in the ILR Review, which is a labor insider paper journal. No one's going to read that
Hmm.
in the big schools these days.
Mm-hmm.
And then Alan and I had offices next to each other, and we were collaborating on a project on school quality. But the minimum wage thing, I can't remember whether Alan or one of us read about this, that New Jersey had sort of passed a minimum wage increase, and there was some concern because the state legislature was trying to overturn it. It was a Democrat governor. It had been proposed by a Democrat legislature, and then the legislature turned over to the opposite side, and they were trying to block it, but the governor eventually managed to override it. So the law turned into effect. But it was just when the law was supposed to occur in April, and so we said, oh, maybe we should try and do an evaluation. And we thought very carefully about the things we'd learned from these other studies, like we need to have a really good control group. We need to really be able to follow all the stores. So we need to make sure we don't have any attrition.
Mm.
And so we put a fair amount of effort into it. But we were kind of in a hurry. So when, there was a downside of it, of being that hurry, we didn't do the greatest job of drawing the sample. So the sample is a little bit, we didn't get, the way we had to do the sample, because we couldn't think of any other way to do it in the short time we had, we just got the phone books.
Oh.
Princeton Library had a huge collection of phone books for Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and we just lined them all up and said, okay, here's the counties, here's the phone books. Let's find the stores.
Yeah. So that's
And the
what,
guy who
that's
was a research
February.
assistant that I
You
hired
start,
to
is it
do the
you're
phone book
starting that?
work.
Are you starting that? Because I know it's February is the baseline. So are you starting this project in the fall?
January.
In January? Oh,
Yeah, we were really up against the
because
wall.
it's going into effect in April.
Supposedly, yeah.
Yeah.
So the guy I hired he was a senior at Princeton, and I was advising his senior thesis, and he helped me. He sat and coded all these things and put them in a spreadsheet so we'd have the phone numbers and addresses of the stores.
Yeah.
And we started talking about how to get a surveyor, because we didn't want to do the whole thing ourselves. And he said, "Well, my grandmother's a surveyor." And I said, "Oh, that's kind of interesting." And so it turned out she was a professional surveyor and lived in Utah,
Oh.
where at that time there were a lot of the survey companies were basically hiring underemployed women.
Mm.
Because a lot of them it was a more traditional Mormon thing, and a lot of
Oh.
women would go back to work, but they wanted to be pretty flexible and stuff. Anyway, so her name was Susan Belden, and so I called her up, and to tell you the truth, I couldn't believe she sounded like she was about 16. It
Mm.
was great on the phone, and Alan and I had done a few testing out our survey, calling fast food restaurants. We got nowhere. Like the managers blew us off.
Mm.
She got like a 88 or 89% response rate. She could get people to answer the phone that you could not imagine how. I don't know how she did it. She was just very persuasive and sort of soft spoken, and she sounded like a young woman.
Yeah.
And I think that all of these things helped a little bit. But
Yeah.
so anyway, that was a huge benefit to have her, because we got such good response rates.
So, why the response to this paper? Well, so Orly said something interesting. I guess like there's so much folklore around the paper, and I was surprised when Orly said something because you read that Wall Street Journal op-ed by James Buchanan, and I think, oh, this must have been the most controversial paper written in the history of economics. But then when I listened to you in that 2012 Michigan speech talking about the empirical crisis in labor, and then you telling me not everybody took the methods, or they took the methods seriously, but they didn't really take the empirical work seriously. So why then does this paper strike a chord? Why didn't people just be like dismissive the way they were like with these other things? Because clearly that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I think, look, first of all, the minimum wage, it used to play a very pivotal role in, everybody would learn about this in the first year of economics. And it was one of the things, economists love to do this. I don't know whether everybody's aware of this, but economists love to say, well, um, there's many things that the average person or the populist voter or something will agitate for, and it'll turn out to be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what so economists love it when somebody analyzes something and shows that the intention of this law was X, but actually it causes minus X.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
And so the minimum wage and rent control were supposed to be the two big examples of that. And
Sure.
it kind of gets at that. It gets at the idea that price regulation is bad, which is,
Right.
pretty strong tenet of a lot of economic thinking.
Yep.
And so it has the law of unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of the price regulation thing, that has this really strong history in sort of conservative economics.
Right.
Conservative economists, especially back in the 50s and 60s, that was just like the number one thing that they thought of as like key that economists had to say. We could not be regulating prices.
Right. Right.
So the minimum wage just pisses them off when as an example.
Well, so was it controversial, the paper? I mean, it's in the AER, so everybody's, reading it. So what was the reaction?
Well, you see, growing up in Princeton, I guess, or whatever, I didn't really quite realize just how badly it was interpreted by people.
Hmm.
But partially, okay, so there was a couple of things that happened. One thing was it was published in the AER, which was supposedly the premier journal.
Yeah.
Um, Another thing that happened was shortly thereafter, I was awarded the Clark Prize.
Oh,
And so that really ticked people off.
right. Right.
Um,
Because it put a big
and
spotlight on the paper, I bet.
yeah, and I can remember. So the person who had to read the citation for the Clark Award for me was Ann Krieger, whose name is spelled like Alan Kruger's name, but she pronounces it Krieger, I think,
Uh-huh.
the German way. And she's a pretty conservative economist, and you could see it was just killing her to read that. she really did like
You wanted to skip that part.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
People forget, economists these days are a little bit more open-minded about markets
Yeah.
and probably a little bit more left of center than they used to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this was a big deal, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, then maybe there was a bunch of um, people who really decided to make it into a bit of a campaign, like
Sure.
Buchanan,
Sure.
lots
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
people.
Right. This diff and diff thing, you mentioned, I actually didn't know about the California paper, and then the Mariel Boatlift paper I do know about, and then all the work in the about it in the 70s and 80s and things. But I actually had kind of had the impression from stuff that you had written with Orly that you were a little lukewarm about the method a little bit, that it wasn't really probably, always something that you would have found very credible. Is that accurate?
Well, because in the original training program case, you don't have parallel trends,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and so um, it it wasn't something that you could just count on being able to apply out of the box.
Right. So so this idea of parallel trends from the very, very start, you were kind of like, you were thinking about it from the very, very beginning. It wasn't just diff and diff without it. You kind
Oh
of
no, it's
together.
right there in that 85 paper, the paper that introduces the term difference of differences. It
Yeah.
basically, we unfortunately we didn't have a graph, but if you when I teach the paper, I show the graph, and it's got
Yeah.
very big dip for the
Right.
treatment group, and that's the thing that everyone nowadays calls the Ashenfelter dip.
Right. Then how come they don't call it the card dip? You feel
Well,
like you
it
were
had
gypped
actually been
up? Gypped
identified in
off?
Orly's earlier paper.
Oh yeah. Okay. I was just
Yeah,
kidding.
yeah, and so we kind of knew that you couldn't use a straight up difference of
Right.
differences thing.
Right.
And that's why we kind of invented this selection correction difference of differences,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which no one has followed up. No one likes that. That was kind of a loser.
Mm-hmm. Well, this like, um I only have a few more minutes. I guess I gotta skip something.
I mean, I can go till 3:30 if you want. I don't
Okay,
care.
good. I do actually want to do that.
Yeah.
So this design stuff, this model versus design stuff, I can't get, ever since I saw that speech, I feel like it's really had a big effect on me. I guess
You got to
I
get over that, Scott.
no, I'm not ready for it. Maybe this will be the time. I'll bring it up with my therapist tomorrow.
Okay, yeah.
um, so explain to me what you meant by this like model versus design approach, and when does it really start to diverge, or like, because in the way that you talk, it's like this kind of like diverging path, but I can't really quite tell exactly when you start to notice it or when it starts to change.
Um, well, I I became aware of
And real quick, could
that
you,
this was a
for the
thing. I
sake
mean,
of the listener, would you mind just saying real quick what we're about to talk about, this whole model versus design?
oh, okay. So I was asked to give the Wojtinski lecture at the University of Michigan in 2012
I think it was 12,
or something.
14. Yeah.
And I did some slides, and I never wrote the paper up, but I did some slides on that, and it was sort of called model-based versus design-based research.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'd become aware of the issue in the 90s, sometime around 1994. There was a meeting of the Econometric Society in Iowa, and in the summer meeting of the Econometric Society, and they organized up a meeting, and Richard Blundell and I were giving the talk, and they sort of wanted to have it be like I was sort of proposing it's sort of what nowadays a lot of people informally call the reduced form
Yeah.
thing,
Right.
and Richard was sort of presenting what you might think of as the structural thing.
Right.
But I realized that that's not, and so I went and talked a little bit, and I mean I know Richard from many years and get along with him fine, and I didn't think there was that much distance between us. He tends to have a more model-based approach on things, and I tend to have a more design-based approach on things. But I've certainly written model-based papers, quite a few before, especially before the 90s.
Yeah.
And anyway, I started thinking about, well, what's really going on? Like, what is this reduced form and structure thing is not very informative. That's not what's really the fundamental question. The fundamental question is, do you think about it as the approach that I have for research is to develop a model. Maybe I come up with a model in some ad hoc way, or maybe I'm thinking about a question and I say I've got to have a model of how that works, and then I'll go and try and figure out whether how that model fits, or what are the key parameters in that model. Whereas the design-based thing says, I got a question, I want to answer it from a research design. I want to come up with a experiment or quasi-experiment or some kind of credible instrumental variables design that could potentially say how big is the effect of X on Y.
Would that have sounded weird to people? I mean, now that seems so natural, but I mean, I'm saying, would Dr. Blundell have been like, what are you talking about? What is that? What does that even mean? Was that there's like a tradition of that kind of language, or I don't really quite see the where this is coming from.
Well, I think that was, I mean, everyone said, I once have pointed out that sometime in the early 90s, Alan Kruger subscribed to the New England Journal of Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And the New England Journal of Medicine papers still the same today. There'd be a short abstract at the beginning of each paper, and it will say, question research design.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're just doing a regression, they call that observational design. But that economists did not use that term.
Research design. Yeah.
That was a completely foreign term. The only time I would have used it was in describing the X matrix in a regression. Sometimes that's called the design matrix. Especially if you're trying to figure out what a statistician is doing. What they call the design matrix is just the big X matrix. But that's coming from Fisherian designs where you're setting up a allocation of treatment and control status to different plots or something.
Right.
So that's the origin of it. But so I think I don't know whether I invented it or I just grabbed it from somebody else, but it struck me as very fundamentally the way that some fields, like I would say even today, most of the time labor economics is design based, and most of the time IO is model based.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that wasn't the way it was in 1982. Like, because one of my thesis advisors was Richard Quant, who was also the thesis advisor of Rob Porter and Tim Bresnahan, the two leaders of Empirical IO at that time, who became. And we all did the same thing. We fit maximum likelihood models to data and tried to calibrate parameters. So there was sort of a divergence over the 90s or 80s. I mean, in kind of the way we approach questions.
Oh. What's it originating with? I mean, it's you guys? It's coming from Princeton? It's people like you and Kruger and Angrist and guys like that?
I guess you would say that was certainly one force. I mean, on the other side, the models that people were needing were more and more complicated.
Yeah.
And I guess you could say, for instance, in macro, there's one tradition which is like calibration tradition, which is like you have a model and then you get a few parameters and calibrate it.
Yeah.
That would be, I guess, Ed Prescott was the guy who coined the phrase calibrated.
Yeah.
Calibration. But the alternative approach was like forecasting approach, where you just have a VAR and just run regressions.
Yeah.
And one time back in the 60s and 70s, those two things were kind of the same again, because the big macro models, they weren't exactly a VAR, they weren't unrestricted regressions, but they weren't exactly like a completely specified logical model. They were like equation by equation. There's a consumption function and an investment function and a government spending function, and people would specify that, and they think of that as like it was a sort of a structural model, but it's not a structural model in the sense that it had any sensible micro origins or anything.
Right.
But so I think you could say at some time in the 70s and 80s, these two things were kind of the same thing. That's what economists did.
Yeah.
And then the modeling became more formal on the model-based side.
Yeah.
More and more important. And the design base became more and more like, okay, we have a conjecture that something causes something else. So it became much more focused on the whole issue of causality.
That word, does it start getting, you remember it in grad school? People saying cause, cause, cause? Because, it's like you can get an entire econometrics field, and that word may not even, back in, when I was in grad school, I don't think I heard the word one time. I mean, I just,
No, actually, there was a tradition in statistics that you weren't allowed to even talk about it.
yeah, right.
And it was a stupid tradition, actually, and they finally gotten rid of it. They started to have in stats and in computer science, they now have causal studies and causal
Yeah.
designs and stuff. They that was a mistake on their part, because actually that was what experiments were supposed to fix, right? And
Right.
I think it might date back in stats to this tradition of Fisher versus um, everybody else, basically.
Yeah, right, right,
I think he was
right.
kind of a difficult man to get along with.
Yeah, I
But
heard
he
that.
basically he was a design guy. There's
Uh-huh.
no question about that. But
Right.
he did invent maximum likelihood and lots of other things too. So he certainly was no slouch on how to do modeling, but he was fundamentally a design guy.
So there's some point in the 90s, you're like, you kind of say, yeah, I think something's different. There's two tribes, whereas there used to be one tribe. Does that happen?
Well, I wasn't. It wasn't like I pronounced that. It was pretty obvious.
It was
Uh,
pretty obvious to other
oh
people
yeah, yeah,
too.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Everybody at that time they all said structural and reduced form, and are we looking for a
Oh,
structural
that's
person
when
in
that
reduced
language
form?
starts
That was
coming
the
out.
language they used.
Oh,
I just thought that was not very informative.
yeah.
Rather, it was like fundamentally is the is the paper being evaluated because it's got a clever research design, or is it
Right.
being evaluated because it has an innovative model?
Yeah. Right. Right. Well, so I'm curious, just to kind of go back to this minimum wage thing. I still don't quite understand. Was there hostility that you guys experienced? I mean, if you only read Buchanan's very colorful op-ed, you would think you guys were getting bricks thrown through your window or something. Like, I mean,
Pretty close to that, yeah.
there really was. Can you tell me a little
Oh,
bit
it
about
was
that?
pretty bad, yeah. I mean, there was yeah, it was pretty awkward, and it was very
Like, give me an anecdote. You don't have to say a name, but like,
um. So, for whatever reason, the American Enterprise Institute decided they wanted to have a forum on minimum wages,
uh-huh.
and so they had Finus Welch and Kevin Murphy come on the other side, and Alan Kruger and I come. And I remember,
This is like late 90s, or is
no,
this
no, this is like
right after the paper?
95 or something, 94, 95.
Okay, so it's like the paper's like out.
Yeah, just around the time the paper's been out,
Yeah.
and we go down there and on the train, and they have this big forum, and there was a labor economist, an old-time Australian labor economist who's still active, named Bob Gregory. And Bob is a very interesting person. It's like if you wanted to have your archetypical, what would happen if you crossed an Australian with a labor economist? You'd get this guy. It's just really, but a really entertaining, observant person. Very, and so Bob is there in the background, and so during the course of this discussion, it gets to be pretty heated. Finus Welch really got pissed off about this whole thing.
uh,
Minimum wages. He just thought that we were. I think, for at least for a long time, thought that we'd faked the data or made something up.
huh.
Um,
But
he was
so why is he
convinced.
doing? I mean, Orly said amongst labor economists, it was not terribly controversial. But is that, he said, because the kinds of papers that have been being written were not so great, and so labor economists were like, nobody
I
knows one
think
way or
Orly
the
might
other.
be there. I think among there were some labor economists who weren't so negative, but there was an ILR symposium on our work
Uh huh.
that had a review of our book, Myth and Measurement, and it has a chapter. It has a paper by Finus, and you could go read that. It's pretty scathingly negative.
Huh. Huh.
Um,
How
anyway, during
old
the
are you?
course
So
of
what are you?
this,
You're like 40. This is like, because you said 50s, so it's like nice. So you're like in your early 40s or like
yeah,
late 30s.
yeah,
What
40.
did it feel? I mean, these guys were probably not just contemporaries. I mean, you probably looked up some of these guys, right? I mean, they were.
They were the leader, like Finance was considered a leader of the field. He basically, his company found its data.
Yeah. So, I mean, what did it feel like to you and Dr. Kruger having so much kind of spiteful negativity? That wasn't very common. That kind of like you didn't have these kinds of throwdown matches, or I mean, you always hear
Not that
stories.
I knew of in labor. That's the first time I'd ever heard of it.
Uh,
So in the course of this conference, a woman economist gets up and she was kind of more conservative side and said, "Well, I just don't understand how you can, be giving all this results. It doesn't make any sense. You've got to remember, or you've got to say, the theory is evidence too, and the theory says very clearly."
mm,
So she, this was a problem that widely spread, that widely viewed that like somehow or other, like theoretical ideas were in a certain way evidence rather than
evidence,
like
right?
nothing to do with
As
evidence.
opposed to being
Yeah,
model or like, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
So could
And
you
anyway,
have?
Bob Gregory comes
That's
out
a
of this
very
meeting and just couldn't
metaphysical.
believe it.
That's like almost this like metaphysical kind of conversation that's got nothing to do with the minimum wage, though. Did you ever find
Exactly,
yourself in these weird conversations that were like, what is knowledge almost? Like, what does
all
it
the
mean?
time.
Really? What was
Yeah.
that? What that must have been very interesting.
Well, yeah, I'm no philosopher, and I don't really have a lot of. I don't have much patience with it because I don't. It's like there's a certain kind of person that loves to talk about stuff like that, but it
Right.
doesn't really go anywhere as far as I know. If you're a really clever writer, you can
But these were
rewrite.
epistemological, but this is kind of like an epistemological kind of shift a little bit because I was, it's funny after it's so ironic. After I listened to your speech, I went back to that James Buchanan quote, and then I went back to the Lemur thing, and then the Hendry deal, and then and then I thought about H. Greg Lewis just dropping all the IV, and I just thought, well, maybe Buchanan's just basically saying there's only theory. None of the empirical papers are ever reliable. So there's nothing special about this paper. They're all just garbage. Like that's what I was kind of wondering. Like,
Yeah.
is there something? It's got nothing to do with the minimum wage. It's just this larger war about what do we, what anything
What are we doing
economists
with
know.
applied work?
Yeah, and like,
Yeah.
what is where does the knowledge come from?
Well, one time when I was an ASPROF at Chicago, John Abowd was my colleague, and we would go to the seminars together and sit in the back row because he was a PhD from Chicago, but it didn't stick with him for some reason.
Uh huh.
His advisor was Arnold Zellner, the Bayesian economist.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
He wasn't a true believer, and he walked out of the seminar and said, "Well, once again, um, the theory has tested the data, and the data has been found lacking."
He's he said that. That's where that
Yeah,
phrase comes from. Oh my gosh, that's famous. You heard him say that?
yeah,
That's clever.
yeah.
That's,
Yeah, so
huh.
that was, I mean, that was sort of widely. That
Yeah,
wasn't just Chicago. That was a lot of places, and maybe even once in a while at Princeton.
yeah,
The theory was testing the data,
yeah.
and the goal that in a way, that's kind of this. There's this famous paper from Koopmans which says theory ahead of measurement.
Hmm.
It's sort of related to that.
Yeah, yeah. Huh.
I don't know. I've never quite understood it because I think in physics or something, people don't think like that.
Right, right.
They think, okay, there's a million hypotheses, and a smart guy can come up with a lot of hypotheses.
Exactly. Yeah, totally, totally.
And so that's not the problem. The problem is trying to figure out which one's right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, right. So, boy, you seem like such a, kind of, what's the right word? Like laid back. So, and kind of steady. And, like, did you find yourself like kind of getting pissed off and just like getting into these, kind of being like getting into, getting mad during this kinds of stuff? Or was it, what was it like? Or what was he? And I'm curious if you
Yeah, many
different
times.
than
I
Dr.
mean,
Kruger.
one time I gave a talk at Chicago. It was while I was working on the minimum wage book, and they asked me to come and give a talk. And so I had written a chapter on the distributional effects of the minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went and gave this talk. And, I kind of reinvestigated that and found some evidence that the prevailing wisdom, the old-fashioned wisdom, was the minimum wage was a real disaster because all it did was that people lost their jobs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Right.
so it actually, totally counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I showed some results that actually, earnings went up rather than down when you raise them in low wage people's earnings went up. That, which is just saying that the elasticity of labor demand is not, bigger than one,
Right. Right.
or if you interpret it neoclassically.
Yeah.
And I showed some preliminary stuff on family structure and who were the types of workers that were working at the minimum wage. And it wasn't just kids and teenagers that were, it was a larger and larger fraction of people who were, supporting families.
Yeah.
And Sherwin Rosen, who, I'd known pretty well, and he was really pissed off. He said, "What's the agenda here?"
Oh, he said that. He challenged you.
Yeah,
He
he
challenged
was
your
really,
motives.
and I didn't really know what to say. So I guess it always struck me the other side was really angry, and it's not very helpful if you're trying to have an argument and the other side is angry. You don't want to get angry yourself. That's not going to win.
Yeah. But being accused of being bad faith is very
It's very upsetting. Yeah.
that's very upsetting. Yeah, that's very rude. That's very different from disagreeing with a paper. So taking it personal. Wow. How did Dr. Kruger take it? Were y'all pretty similar
Pretty badly,
personalities?
I think, too. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a great period of our lives.
Huh. Wow.
Actually, what he was in the Department of Labor when the minimum wage book came out,
Oh,
and then in 1996, I guess there was a proposal to raise the minimum wage under Clinton, and he was pretty highly involved with that.
yeah.
And one of the congressmen from New Jersey basically like led some investigation against him because the Republicans had gained control of the House.
Gosh.
And they had a huge investigation of him and went through all his papers and financing and everything. Like his personal finances. I didn't know you could do that in the United States.
Oh my
Now, luckily
gosh.
for Alan, his father was an accountant, and Alan had the cleanest accounts in the entire
Oh my
country.
gosh. That
I mean,
is so infuriating to even
it
hear.
was really scary. I mean, it was like you realize that, and this kind of thing is happening all the time nowadays.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And see, but that was the first time I'd ever been aware that that happened in the U.S.
Mm.
Canada. I don't think that happens in Canada.
So you guys were is it there's like close friends and then there's like really good co-authors and they don't have to be the same thing. Where were you and Dr. Kruger on that spectrum?
I would say we were more of the really good co-authors than super close friends. Yeah, uh, we hung out and stuff, but we didn't have vacation together or anything like
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Well, what made y'all work together so well then? How'd you complement each other?
Um, hmm. Well, I guess I was a tiny bit more technical than him, and he was a bit more like like his natural instinct would be to go and do a survey or go and dig up some data or something. And so, the two things together was a good combination. We weren't that far apart in terms of
Yeah.
our orientation.
Mhm.
And basically his he was from his father was an accountant and his mother was a teacher, but he wasn't from a rich family or anything. And he sort of had the sympathy of, we shared the sort of same sympathy, which was we don't naturally think that. So here's something that I always tell people: there's many economists who they think the number one problem in the labor market is that wages are too high.
There's some
So you've
labor
got a
economists
recession,
that
wages are too high. You've got
there's the
unemployment,
labor
wages are
economists
too
that think that way. Labor economists that say the wages are too high.
labor economists don't usually think that, because labor
Oh,
economists
don't.
usually think, there's something naturally like we think everybody's working and we're on their side in a certain
Right.
sense.
Right.
But
Yeah.
the rest of the profession is sort of on the other side,
Yeah. Right.
in
We all
my
have
view.
that shared sensibility a little bit.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so we kind of shared that sensibility.
Yeah.
We were fairly similar in age. I'm only
Mm,
4 years older than him.
mm, mm. So, so you leave. How come you end up leaving Princeton? You
My
go
wife was
straight to Berkeley, or do you go somewhere else first?
no, I went to Berkeley. My wife was is a music historian, and she
Oh,
was PhD from Princeton, and she got a job at Columbia, but she didn't get tenure.
okay.
And so she wanted to move to California and switch careers.
Oh,
And I wouldn't have done it without her, wanting to do it.
yeah.
But I think it was in the end, it was a very good choice.
Did you think about like Stanford, or were they fighting for you over there?
Oh, they didn't want to hire me. There was a guy there, Tom McCurry, was very strongly opposed to hiring me.
Yeah, because he heard you were going to bring smoke into Stanford or something.
No, yeah, he just did. He really didn't like the minimum wage work either.
Yeah, sure, sure. There's this really interesting quote. I usually pull it up, but I'm not gonna pull it up. It's by Shockley, who also won the Nobel Prize in physics, I think. He used to run Bell Labs, and he's got this like paper on, basically how do you get to have what characterizes people that have like a gabillion citations and they get tons of grants, and it's all about these kind of right tail scientists. And he's got this really interesting part, and he basically lays out essentially a Cobb Douglas production function. He doesn't call it that, but he says, there's like, for example, there might be 8 inputs, and he kind of goes through and kind of describes these inputs as like, there's like this logarithm thing in it, but it's like knowing when to find a good paper, knowing how to recognize a good idea, knowing how to collect the data, knowing when you've worked on it enough, being a good enough writer, seeing it through through the whole process and learning from the journal and all of these things. And it was really kind of interesting reading it because it was a Cobb Douglas production function. If you didn't have all 8 of these inputs, you could be phenomenal in 7. You didn't have that 8th, which was
Yeah,
you wouldn't produce a
rank
paper.
theory.
Yeah. So I was kind of curious, I know it's hard to, it seems like it's always hard to kind of figure out because it's all speculative when you wonder and go, well, what's my production function? But I'm just curious, like, what do you think the inputs are that you've had? And, like, why are you so good? I don't even, I'm not asking you to tell me that you're smart. I'm saying, like, why is it that you've been able to consistently do at a high level? What are all the inputs that you think really matter and that you feel like you've got, whether it was you or other people around you?
Well, probably I'm a little more patient than most people, and so if I get some idea, I'll kind of play around with it, and I will. Fundamentally, I often believe that almost anything can be made into a good paper if you're willing to work on it long enough and dig around and find out something.
Hmm.
That isn't necessarily the way to write a paper fast, but it
Right.
does. And I'd like to I like to interact with people and like find out what they're doing and seeing, like how they're thinking about things and what problems they're confronting and stuff. And that, that's very important in economics these days, especially.
Hmm.
Almost nobody is writing papers by themselves anymore.
Right. 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 Right.
And when you get older, that's even more important because you're stretched a little thin on for time, and so it's very helpful to interact with younger people and see what their problems they've got and what kind of things they're working on. Alan Manning kind of says, as you get older, if you remain, the only way to remain successful is vampirism. You basically you basically grab ideas from other people, and
Yeah.
if you're lucky, they'll work with you long enough to get your name on the paper. So
Right.
that's there's some extent of that.
Yeah.
I I think I one thing that's probably true is that I kind of think about things in the way from the point of view of the people on the bottom, the ground up.
Hmm.
So I'm better at thinking about like really partial equilibrium things than on general equilibrium things, and I don't try and worry about that other stuff. I focus on like, why is this person making this decision in this framework?
Hmm.
And then whereas other people they don't think that, they think that's kind of dull and they want to do all the general equilibrium stuff.
Wait, so
And
why would that make you more productive that you're focusing on
well,
stuff
because
like that?
I don't waste time on something I'm no good at.
You're not getting distracted by stuff that's like you're not good at or something? Is that the
Yeah, that's what I think. Is I tend not to, so I won't, you'll see, actually see this in, especially among young people, their math isn't very good or something. So they'll basically spend a huge amount of time trying to tech up
Right.
rather
Right.
than say, okay, let me just understand this to the level that I can use it, and let
Mm.
me, maybe I can eventually figure out how to innovate on it. But I don't need to be, on top of every technical detail of everything or whatever.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I'm definitely not a control freak. So
Yeah.
with co-authorship, that's definitely another thing. Like I'm perfectly willing to let other people do lots of other stuff.
Hmm. This is random, but this tyranny of the top five that Heckman talks about, it's funny, like being, being working now. I don't even have no idea if the way he sort of made it seem like it's newer, but I was just kind of curious. I mean, is it, I would just have thought it would always been that there were these, like, that there was this sheer gradient, difference in all these top fives and stuff, but you've gotten to see this evolution over your career, and I'm curious, what exactly has changed with these journals that somebody like me wouldn't even be able to appreciate. Like, what would somebody from the past coming into now, would they be like, oh yeah, this is different, this wasn't how it was?
Uh, so my understanding was in my time, I'm quite a bit younger than Jim. Um, so I started writing papers in like 82 or something. But by then it was very clear there was like the top five, and
Mm-hmm.
what was important for tenure was papers in those journals. And maybe there was a little more recognition for papers in second level journals. But another thing that's happened is the particular set of second level journals has turned around, whereas the
Mm,
particular set of top fives has not.
right. So, like, what
So,
was the second set when you were in grad school? It wasn't like already
well,
stat.
Restat would have been a second tier, but like the Journal of Economic Theory was really important.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
That was, and it's kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Um, Econom Economica,
Yeah.
that's that journal that Henry's paper's in, and
Hmm.
Orly and I have a paper on U.S. and Canadian unemployment rates in there. Richard Lipsey's famous paper on Phillips's famous paper, they're in that journal. That journal has fallen in rank quite a bit.
Okay. I was just curious that
Yeah.
I just wondered,
So I would
it was like
say,
a different era or
to
something.
me, it's been the same. And my understanding, for instance, at Princeton, the committee that evaluates people for at the top level, the administrative committee, has a list of journals for each field that are the ones that count, and it's
Hmm.
always been this five in economics.
Hmm. So Angrist said something interesting one time. He said he likes to ask grad students if there was a paper that they wish they had written. And he said Bob Lalone's job market paper was a paper that he kind of wished that could have been his paper, or it's something like that. And I was kind of curious, are there papers that you just sort of so admire, that you just think, I would have loved to have been a part of that paper?
Um,
Is that even kind of a foreign way of thinking?
I I guess that is. I mean, there's some papers that I like disruptive papers.
Mm,
That to me, that's the most important thing, is whether the paper is the more disruptive, the better. And recently there was an event at Princeton for the 100th anniversary of the IR section, and so I got a chance to sort of expound on this a little bit. And I was thinking about like what are the really disruptive papers. I guess you'd say that minimum wage paper is fairly disruptive.
yeah.
What makes a disruptive paper is it's the time and the place and the question and the methodology. They all have to kind of be the right thing for that time and that topic. Um, so I would say, a lot of papers I don't. One set of papers I really admire for their incredible disruption was the set of papers that Otter, Dorn, and Hansen have done on the effects of trade
Yeah.
on communities and labor markets and social structures. I mean, that turned out to be very influential
Mm.
and super disruptive
When
because it
you
sort
say
of said,
disruptive, what does disruptive mean? It means that it really gets everybody's attention. It really
It
changes
gets you
literature.
rethinking what you thought you knew.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So, there had always been this discussion about trade, and like there was winners and losers. But so you had that, and then that was all you said. But no one really. And then there was a lot of discussion about like compensating the losers, but it
Yeah.
was completely abstract, right?
Right.
No one really thought about how big the losses are. And of course, in the theoretical models, a lot of things are true that aren't true empirically. And so David Otter and Gordon and David, there's two Davids and Gordon. Their work really, probably not entirely what they intended, but it's really caused people to really think about how um, when you take away the kind of economic well-being of a community, how it messes up the labor market, it messes up the community, it messes up the people that grow up there. So people have shown that there's an opioid epidemic is worse there, that the marital dissolution is worse there. People don't leave those communities nearly as much as you'd think. So a lot of our thinking about the way these big external forces impact individual communities is really heightened by that work. So I
Yeah.
would say that's definitely a paper that if I would have thought of it, I would have thought that was a really important thing to do, and I'm glad they did it.
That's funny though. You think about that the fights you were having over the minimum wage. It also kind of almost seems like it was a group of people that did not like disruptive papers.
Yeah, people don't like disruptive papers.
They don't
I
like
love
it. They don't
disruptive
want to
papers.
change their mind. It's
Yeah,
costly to change your mind.
yeah.
So it's funny then. You aren't bothered as much by changing your mind, it seems like. It doesn't upset you, or it's like you don't it doesn't seem like there's as much at stake or something like that.
Well, I think there isn't really, it's not like we've got, quantum physics type models that we
Right.
kind of think are probably right at least 97% of the time or something, right? We got
Right.
nothing like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of the things that we think we understand, they maybe are only ephemeral in the sense that those institutions can change, like
Totally.
how much people are stuck in a community versus are willing to move away. That really matters for understanding the impacts of something like minimum wages or trade or something.
Yeah.
But that could be very different in one society than another.
Totally. Yep. Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. 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 Yeah.
So
Uh,
I don't think I don't think it's really possible to have the same thing with like preferences about family, how families organize themselves or something. That seems like that some people want to take that as there's a set of rules that govern that in all situations, but I don't really think so.
right. 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 Yeah. 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 Well, I have one last question. So if you could go back in time to like your younger self at any time, either maybe during the minimum wage stuff or grad school or even being like a young kid, and you could tell them, about what's important in life that they probably at that time, might have felt a lot of anxiety about your young self, or maybe just the uncertainty of it. What do you think you would tell them about life, career, that really you think now they really need to know that as a young person in the
Hmm.
profession?
I don't know. I don't really know whether I have a good answer to that, Scott. In all honesty, I feel like most of my career has been, I've been incredibly lucky, and probably like being a labor economist in the 1980s, that was a very good fit for my personality and my skills, and there was some opportunities to do things that wouldn't that aren't as open today because so much work has already been done and somebody has to go in a slightly different area. Um, but I don't know whether I could have told myself that that was going to be a good area to be in, or whether it was just luck, really.
Yeah.
Um, I personally, for instance, I feel like if I was a young person today, I would probably tell myself to go into computer science.
Oh yeah, really?
Yeah, I just they aren't so burdened with I admire the fact that you can kind of do pretty weird stuff in computer science and it'll be a contribution.
Right.
So they love disruption.
Right.
So I admire that.
Yeah.
Of them, and I think we should try and work better in our field to get more of that, like more appreciation of somebody. If somebody comes in and says, "Okay, well, we used to think this was all right. It's completely different now." That's great.
Yeah.
Even better.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Card, this has been really fun for me and a real honor. I've so enjoyed just getting to know you a little bit better. It's our first time to talk, so I was really liked this talk.
Well, thank you. I was going to say I really admire your book, and I had my students. The fact that you made it available and you got all these, you put a lot of work into that, and I think it's really helped popularize some of these ideas that we've talked about a little bit, and made it available to the masses in a way that it's really hard to figure out how to get some of those ideas across if you're not in the classroom there teaching it. And I think you've made a big contribution there.
Well, I enjoy telling people about you and the stuff that people in your cohort have done. It means a lot to me to get to write about it. And I love writing, and I love sharing all this stuff with people. So it's been really a delight. So I'll maybe one of these days I'll write the David Card, the mixtape biography. I'll come down and do this.
Well, I'm a jazz guy.
Jazz guy.
Yeah.
I've got
here. Pretty strict rules about this.
I skipped my, all right. Well, here was my jazz question that I asked Orly too, and Angrist. So I heard that, we'll end with this. I heard this, a journalist interviewed Dizzy Gillespie, and he asked him, why did he set out to make bebop jazz? And Gillespie said he didn't. He was just trying to make good music. And so I look at your career and I see somebody who made bebop jazz, but everything I've read about you is consistent with that. It doesn't seem like you were ever trying to do anything but just make good music. So I was curious, what's your response to that? Dizzy saying that?
Yeah, that's true. And the thing I would say about him was he had, for many years, he had a great band, and he brought in all these young people. Miles Davis did the same, and several other, Art Blakey. They trained these young people that then, in some cases, went on and surpassed them. And like Blakey had Wayne Shorter in his band for many years or whatever. And so that's an important part of our profession, just like it is in music, that you basically have to. And you can contribute really importantly at that level, in that role, and even if you yourself aren't like getting the best gigs.
Yeah.
you can hope your kids get the best gig. Right. And I think that if everybody thought about it that way, it'd be more that would be good for the field.
Yeah. Well, you've made some good music, and you seem to have made also, without meaning to, made bebop. So
okay.
Well, it's really nice talking.
Nice of you to think that.
Hope we run into each other.
Okay, bye.
All right, you have a great day.
Gotta see us through.